June 6, 1944, 7:25 a.m. The ramp drops. Bullets scream through the air. Explosions tear through the morning mist. And one man steps forward into hell itself. His name was Captain Thomas Anstey Wardle, and he became the first British soldier to set foot on Sword Beach during the largest amphibious invasion in human history. But this isn't just a story about being first. This is a story about a decision that changed everything. A split-second choice between life and death, between victory and catastrophic failure. What you're about to hear has been buried in classified documents for decades. The full truth about those first terrifying moments on Sword Beach. The moments that determined whether D-Day would succeed or become the greatest military disaster of all time. And if you think you know the D-Day story, you don't know this. Before we dive into one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in military history, hit that subscribe button right now. Because on this channel, we uncover the untold stories of World War II, the moments that textbooks ignore, the heroes whose names should echo through history, but somehow got lost along the way. Don't let the algorithm bury these stories. Subscribe, turn on notifications. Let's preserve these memories together. Now let's go back to that beach. Let's go back to the moment when one man's courage lit the fuse that would liberate Europe. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Thousands of landing craft bob violently in the English Channel. Inside one of these vessels, packed shoulder to shoulder with the men of the East Yorkshire Regiment, sits Captain Wardle. He's 24 years old, too young to vote in some places, old enough to lead men into the teeth of Nazi Germany's Atlantic Wall. The naval bombardment has already begun. Even from miles offshore, the men can see the horizon flickering with orange fire. Battleships and cruisers are pounding the French coastline with shells the size of small cars. The noise is so overwhelming that soldiers can't hear each other shout. They can only feel the percussion waves hitting their chests like invisible fists. Captain Wardle checks his watch. 4 hours until H-hour. 4 hours until his landing craft would hit Sword Beach. 4 hours until he would either be dead or standing on French soil for the first time since Dunkirk 4 years earlier. But here's what makes this moment extraordinary. Wardle isn't thinking about glory. He isn't thinking about medals or recognition. According to his own diary, which survived the war and was only declassified in 1999, he's thinking about a promise he made to his mother. A promise that he would come home. A promise that in less than 5 hours would be tested in ways no human being should ever have to endure. The Allied plan for Sword Beach was audacious. Some would say insane. The beach was defended by elements of the 716th Infantry Division, reinforced by the battle-hardened troops of the 21st Panzer Division, positioned just inland. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, mines, barbed wire, tank traps, everything the Nazi war machine could devise to turn that beach into a killing ground. And the British were going to walk straight into it. Sword Beach was the easternmost of the 5 D-Day landing beaches. Its mission was critical. Punch through the coastal defenses, link up with Canadian forces landing on Juno Beach to the west, and capture the city of Caen by nightfall. If they failed, the entire left flank of the Allied invasion would collapse. The Germans could roll up the beaches one by one. D-Day would become D-disaster. No pressure, right? Captain Wardle's unit, part of the 8th Infantry Brigade, would be in the first wave. Not the second wave, not the reserve, the first wave. The men who would hit the beach while the German defenses were still fully intact, before the engineers could clear the obstacles, before the armor could provide support, before anyone knew if the pre-invasion bombardment had done anything except wake up the enemy. As dawn broke on June 6th, Wardle and his men transferred from their transport ship to their landing craft. The sea was rough. Men were already sick, some from fear, most from the violent pitching of the small boats as they formed up for their run to shore. The landing craft lurched forward, 7 miles of open water between them and France, 7 miles during which they would be completely exposed, sitting ducks if German E-boats found them, helpless if shore batteries got their range. Through the early morning gloom, Wardle could start to make out the French coastline. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful, the kind of beach where families would vacation before the war, where children would build sandcastles and couples would walk hand in hand at sunset. Now it was a fortress, and he was going to assault it. The naval gunfire was still hammering the shore. Rockets from specialized landing craft were arcing overhead, dozens at a time, creating a sound like freight trains passing overhead. The plan was for this bombardment to suppress the German defenses, to keep their heads down, to give the first wave a chance. But Wardle knew something that would later be confirmed by military historians. The bombardment, while spectacular, was largely ineffective. Most of the shells were falling inland, missing the beach defenses entirely. The concrete bunkers were built to withstand direct hits from battleship guns, and the Germans weren't cowering in their holes. They were manning their weapons, waiting. As the landing craft closed within a mile of shore, the naval gunfire ceased. Suddenly, the world went eerily quiet, just the sound of diesel engines and waves slapping against the hull. Then the German guns opened up. Mortar shells began exploding in the water around the landing craft. Geysers of white water erupted as German gunners found their range. Machine gun fire stitched across the waves. Somewhere to the left, Wardle saw another landing craft take a direct hit. One moment it was there, packed with British soldiers. The next moment it simply wasn't. 30 seconds, the naval coxswain shouted. Wardle stood up. So did his men. They were packed so tightly that movement was almost impossible. Everyone was weighed down with at least 60 pounds of equipment. Ammunition, grenades, rations, radios. Some men carried mortars. Others carried flamethrowers. All of them carried fear. 20 seconds. The beach was clearly visible now. Wardle could see the obstacles in the water. Steel hedgehogs designed to rip open landing craft. Wooden stakes topped with mines. And beyond the obstacles, the beach itself. Gray sand, a low stone wall, and behind that wall, the German guns. 10 seconds. Good luck, lads. The landing craft's engine roared as the coxswain tried to get them as close to shore as possible. Closer meant less time exposed on the beach, but closer also meant running onto the obstacles. 5 seconds. This is the moment when Captain Thomas Wardle became the first British soldier to face the ultimate question. When the ramp drops, do you freeze or do you run forward into hell? Go, go, go! The ramp crashed down into the surf. Immediately, German machine gun fire raked the inside of the landing craft. Men fell, screaming. The water around the ramp turned red, and Captain Wardle stepped forward. Not ran, not charged, stepped, one deliberate boot after another, into chest-deep water, into a storm of bullets, into history. He was the first Allied soldier to set foot on Sword Beach, the first to face the full fury of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the first to prove that it could be done. Behind him, his men followed, those who could. The water was so deep that some men, weighed down by their equipment, simply sank and drowned before they could even see the beach. Others were cut down by machine gun fire before they took 3 steps, but Wardle kept moving, wading through the surf, bullets snapping past his head, explosions erupting around him. He had only one thought, recorded later in his diary: keep moving. If I stop, we all stop. If we all stop, we all die. 50 yards through the water, the longest 50 yards of his life. Every step expecting the bullet that would end everything. Every step knowing that behind him, men were dying. Good men, British soldiers who had trained for years for this moment. Friends, brothers. 40 yards. His legs were burning. The weight of his equipment was dragging him down. Water sloshed in his boots. His uniform was soaked, making everything heavier. 30 yards. A mortar shell landed 10 feet to his left. The blast wave knocked him sideways. Shrapnel peppered the water, but he stayed on his feet, kept moving. 20 yards. The beach was so close now. Just a little further. Almost there. 10 yards. The water was getting shallower. He could move faster, break into a run, and then his boot hit sand. Sword Beach. French soil. The first British soldier to make it. But standing on the beach was just the beginning. In fact, it was the most dangerous place to be. The Germans had zeroed in every inch of that beach with mortars and machine guns. The sand itself was mined. The seawall offered cover, but it was still 50 yards away across open ground. Wardle didn't hesitate. He ran, sprinting across the sand, weaving between obstacles, jumping over bodies. British bodies, men who had landed seconds before him and never made it off the beach. Machine gun fire kicked up sand at his feet. An MG-42, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, the fastest machine gun in the world. The sound was like tearing canvas, continuous, Deadly. He dove behind a beach obstacle. A moment to breathe, to assess, to figure out what the hell to do next. Behind him, more landing craft were hitting the beach. Men were pouring out. Some made it. Many didn't. The beach was chaos, smoke, fire, screaming. The noise was indescribable. Even veterans of North Africa and Italy, men who had seen combat before, said they had never experienced anything like Sword Beach. Wardle looked around. He needed to find his men, rally them, get them organized, because right now, they were just targets, scattered across the beach, pinned down, dying. He spotted his sergeant, a tough Yorkshireman named Bill Harris, crouched behind a burned-out tank obstacle. Wardle sprinted to him. Somehow, miraculously, he made it, without getting hit. "We need to take out that pillbox," Wardle shouted, pointing to a concrete bunker 50 yards up the beach. That's where the machine gun fire was coming from. As long as that gun was firing, no one else was getting off the beach alive. Harris nodded. No words needed. They both knew what had to be done. What happened next would define the Battle of Sword Beach, would define D-Day, would define what it meant to be a British soldier. He gathered a handful of men. 6 soldiers. That's all he could find who were still combat effective. 6 men to assault a fortified German position. The textbook says you need a 3-to-1 advantage to assault a defensive position. Wardle was going to try it with 6 to who knows how many. He didn't think about the odds, didn't think about the impossibility. He thought about one thing. If that pillbox wasn't taken, everyone on this beach would die. His men, the men still in the water, the men in the next wave. Everyone. So he did what British soldiers have done for centuries when facing impossible odds. He fixed his bayonet, checked his rifle, and prepared to charge. "On me! We're taking that bunker!" And 6 British soldiers, soaking wet, exhausted, terrified, but absolutely determined, rose from cover and charged across Sword Beach towards a German machine gun nest. This is where we'll pause part 1, because what happened in the next 5 minutes is so extraordinary, so unbelievable, that it deserves its own telling. And trust me, you're not going to believe how Captain Thomas Wardle and his 6 men took that pillbox. But before we get there, I need you to do something. If you're gripped by this story, if you want to know what happened next, hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who appreciates real heroes, real courage, real history. And make sure you're subscribed, because part 2 drops soon, and you're not going to want to miss what happens when Wardle reaches that bunker. These men saved the world. The least we can do is remember them.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you need to watch part 1 first. Seriously, go back and watch it right now, because what we're about to cover will make no sense without understanding what Captain Thomas Wardle and his men just went through to reach this moment. For those who are caught up, we left Wardle and 6 British soldiers about to charge a German pillbox on Sword Beach. 1 officer, 6 men, against a fortified concrete bunker with a machine gun that can fire 1,200 rounds per minute. The kind of odds that make sane people surrender. But these weren't sane people. These were British soldiers on D-Day, and surrender was not in the playbook. What happened in the next 5 minutes would be studied in military academies for the next 80 years. It would earn medals, it would save hundreds of lives, and it would prove that sometimes raw courage can overcome impossible odds. Before we dive in, do me a favor. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. We're bringing you the stories that Hollywood ignores, the real heroes, the real battles, the moments that actually mattered. Don't let YouTube's algorithm bury history. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's make sure these stories live forever. Now, let's get back to that beach. Let's get back to the moment when Captain Wardle made the decision that would change everything. 7 men, sprinting across open sand, toward a German bunker that had already killed dozens of Allied soldiers in the last 15 minutes. The machine gun swiveled toward them. Wardle could see the muzzle flash, could see the tracer rounds arcing toward his team. Time seemed to slow down. Later he would describe it as the strangest sensation of his life. Watching bullets come at you, knowing that any one of them could end you, but somehow, impossibly, running forward anyway. Private Johnny Mitchell, a 19-year-old from Leeds, was the first to fall. One moment he was running beside Wardle, the next moment he crumpled to the sand, dead before he hit the ground. No dramatic death scene, no final words, just alive, then not alive. But the other 6 kept running, because stopping meant dying. The only safety was forward. Take the bunker or die trying. The Germans inside the pillbox were likely shocked. Most soldiers, when faced with that kind of firepower, go to ground. They find cover. They wait for support. They call in artillery. They do anything except charge straight at the gun. But British infantry doctrine in 1944 was built on one principle: aggressive action. Attack. Always attack. Even when it seems suicidal. Especially when it seems suicidal. Because defensive positions are only strong if the defenders feel safe. Make them afraid. Make them panic. And suddenly, concrete walls don't matter as much. 30 yards from the bunker, Wardle could see the slit in the concrete where the machine gun barrel protruded. Such a small opening, maybe 8 inches wide, but from that opening, death was pouring out in a steady stream. 20 yards. Another man fell. Corporal Davies took a round through the chest, went down hard. But even as he fell, he threw his grenade toward the bunker. It fell short, exploded harmlessly on the sand. But the intent was there. The spirit was there. Even dying, he was still fighting. 15 yards. This was the critical distance. Close enough to throw a grenade with accuracy, close enough that the Germans inside the bunker would realize what was about to happen. "Grenades!" Wardle shouted. The 5 remaining soldiers pulled pins simultaneously. Standard British Mills bombs. 7 seconds from pin pull to detonation. Throw too early, and the Germans can throw them back or take cover. Throw too late, and you're holding a live grenade. They threw, 5 grenades arcing through the air toward that narrow opening in the concrete. It was like trying to throw a cricket ball through a mail slot from 50 feet away, while running, while being shot at, while terrified. 3 grenades missed, bounced off the concrete, exploded outside the bunker, loud, impressive, but ultimately ineffective. But 2 grenades went in, straight through that narrow slit, into the bunker, into the room where German soldiers were manning their machine gun. The explosion inside a confined, concrete space is different than an explosion in the open air. The blast wave has nowhere to go. It bounces off the walls, amplifies, turns the interior into a pressure cooker of fire and shrapnel. The machine gun stopped firing. But Wardle knew better than to assume the position was neutralized. Military training: never assume the enemy is dead. Never assume you've won. Check. Clear. Confirm. He reached the bunker entrance, a steel door slightly ajar. Smoke was pouring out. He could hear groaning inside. Germans, wounded, maybe dying, maybe just stunned, maybe waiting with weapons ready. This was the moment where training took over, where your body does what it's been taught to do, even when your brain is screaming at you to run away. Wardle kicked the door open.
Sergeant Harris was right behind him. They had practiced this 1,000 times. Room clearing. One of the most dangerous operations in infantry combat. Tight spaces, multiple enemies, nowhere to hide. Inside, the bunker was carnage. The 2 grenades had done their job. 3 German soldiers were dead. 2 more were wounded, sitting against the wall, hands raised in surrender. The machine gun was destroyed, barrel bent, mechanism shattered. But the fight wasn't over. From a side room, a German officer emerged, pistol raised. He fired 2 shots. The first round hit Harris in the shoulder, spun him around. The second round missed Wardle by inches. Wardle didn't think, didn't aim carefully, didn't quote regulations. He raised his rifle and fired. 3 shots, center mass. The German officer went down. The bunker was secure. Aftermath of the assault. Outside, British soldiers were flooding up the beach. With the machine gun nest eliminated, the killing field had become passable. Men who had been pinned down for 20 minutes were now able to advance. Landing craft that had been circling offshore, afraid to approach, were now beaching and disgorging troops. Captain Wardle had been on Sword Beach for exactly 17 minutes. In that time, he had become the first British soldier to reach the beach, led an assault on a fortified position, and opened up the entire landing zone for the follow-on forces. But there was no time to celebrate, no time to process what had just happened, because the battle for Sword Beach was far from over. German artillery was now ranging in on the beach, 88mm shells, the most feared artillery piece in the German arsenal, accurate, deadly.
The explosions were massive, throwing sand and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Each shell could kill everyone within a 50-foot radius. And more German forces were moving into position. The 21st Panzer Division, tanks. The British had landed infantry and engineers. They didn't have heavy armor ashore yet. If German panzers reached the beach before British tanks arrived, it would be a massacre. Wardle rallied what was left of his platoon. Out of the 50 men who had landed with him, only 23 were still combat effective. Some were dead, some were wounded, some were simply missing, lost in the chaos of the landing. But 23 was enough, because now they had a foothold. Now they had momentum. And momentum in warfare is everything. Pushing inland. The objective was clear: get off the beach. Establish a perimeter inland, hold until reinforcements arrived. Simple in theory, nearly impossible in practice. Between the beach and relatively safe ground was a series of German defensive positions. More pillboxes, trenches, minefields. Every inch of ground had been prepared for this moment. The Germans had known for years that the Allies would eventually invade. They had spent those years turning the French coast into the most fortified position in human history. And Wardle's job was to crack it open. His platoon moved in textbook fashion: fire and maneuver. One section provides covering fire while another section advances. Leapfrog your way forward. Never give the enemy a stationary target. Keep moving, keep shooting, keep the pressure on. They encountered their first German trench 50 yards inland. Wardle could see helmets, movement, the glint of rifle barrels. He signaled to his Bren gun team. The Bren was the British light machine gun, not as fast-firing as the MG-42, but more accurate, more controllable, and in the hands of a trained gunner, absolutely lethal. The Bren opened up. Trencher rounds walked across the German position. Wood and dirt flew as bullets tore through the trench. The Germans ducked down, and while they were ducking, Wardle's assault section moved, sprinting forward, zigzagging, making themselves hard targets. They covered 30 yards before the Germans even realized they were moving. Grenades again, into the trench, explosions, screaming. Then Wardle and his men were in the trench itself. Close quarters combat. Rifles, bayonets, sometimes just fists and helmets. Brutal, primal, the kind of fighting that doesn't make it into Hollywood movies because it's too ugly, too real. The trench was theirs. 8 German soldiers captured, 3 dead, 1 British soldier wounded. Not bad. Not bad at all. The counterattack. But the Germans weren't done. Not by a long shot. Around 10 a.m., reports started coming in. Tank engines. Lots of them. The 21st Panzer Division was moving. This was the nightmare scenario. British infantry in the open, German tanks bearing down on them. No anti-tank guns had made it ashore yet. The beach was still too congested, too chaotic. Some weapons were still underwater. Others were destroyed in the landing. Wardle's platoon had exactly 3 anti-tank weapons. Sticky bombs, basically grenades on a stick that you had to physically attach to the tank, which meant getting close enough to touch a 30-ton steel monster while it was trying to kill you. Not ideal odds. The first German tank appeared over a ridgeline at 10:23 a.m. A Panzer IV, gun transversing, looking for targets. And it found them. Wardle's platoon, out in the open, nowhere to hide. The tank fired. The explosion was deafening. The shell hit 20 feet from Wardle's position. The blast wave knocked him flat, ears ringing, vision blurred, but alive. The tank started rolling forward, towards them.
Infantry following behind it. A coordinated counterattack designed to throw the British back into the sea. This was the moment. If Wardle's platoon broke, if they ran, if they failed to stop that tank, then everything would unravel. More tanks would come. The beachhead would collapse. D-Day would fail. But Wardle didn't run. Neither did his men, because that's what the training was for. That's what the spirit was for. That's what being British soldiers was for. "Get me those sticky bombs," Wardle shouted. Private Robert Bobby Thompson volunteered, 22 years old, for Manchester, had never seen a tank in combat before today, was absolutely terrified, did it anyway. Thompson grabbed 2 sticky bombs, 60 pounds of high explosive, armed them, and started crawling toward the advancing panzer. The tank's machine gun was firing, sweeping across the field, cutting down anything that moved. Thompson had to time his movement, wait for the gun to traverse past, move, freeze, wait, move again. It took him 3 minutes to cover 50 yards. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. Every second expecting the machine gun to find him. Every second knowing that if it did, there wouldn't be enough left of him to send home. But he made it, reached the tank, slapped the first sticky bomb on the track, primed it, rolled away. 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion shattered the track. The Panzer lurched to a halt, immobilized, but not destroyed. The crew was still alive. The gun still worked. Thompson went back, under fire, tank crew shooting at him with pistols from the open hatches. He reached the tank again, climbed up, placed the second bomb directly on the turret ring, and ran like hell. This explosion was bigger, louder. The turret blew off. Flame and smoke erupted from the interior. The crew tried to bail out. Some made it, others didn't. The German infantry, seeing their tank destroyed, lost their nerve. They fell back. The counterattack had failed. Bobby Thompson crawled back to British lines, covered in dirt, bleeding from a dozen small wounds, grinning like a maniac. Wardle recommended him for the military medal on the spot. By noon, Sword Beach was secure. The British had penetrated nearly 2 miles inland. Tanks and artillery were finally coming ashore. The beachhead was established. The link-up with Canadian forces on Juno Beach was underway. D-Day was succeeding. Against all odds, against the strongest defenses ever built, against an enemy that had spent 4 years preparing for this moment. And it succeeded because men like Captain Thomas Wardle and Private Bobby Thompson and Sergeant Bill Harris did impossible things. Not because they were superhuman, not because they didn't feel fear, but because they did their duty, even when their duty required them to charge machine guns and fight tanks with bombs on sticks. But the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Allies had landed, but they hadn't won yet. The fighting for Normandy would continue for months, brutal, bloody, some of the hardest combat of the entire war, and Captain Wardle would be there for all of it. But that's a story for part 3, because what happened to Wardle and his men after D-Day is just as remarkable as what happened on the beach, and the lessons they learned, the price they paid, the way the war changed them. That's the story that needs to be told. Part 3 drops soon, and I promise you it's going to hit different, because we're going to talk about what happens after the glory, after the adrenaline wears off, after you realize that you survived when so many of your friends didn't. If you're invested in this story, smash that like button, share this with everyone, and subscribe, because part 3 is the conclusion, and you're not going to want to miss how this story ends. These men deserve to be remembered. Let's make sure they are. This is where the story gets real. We've spent 2 episodes talking about heroism, about courage, about impossible odds overcome by sheer determination. And all of that is true, every word. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Heroism has a cost. Courage leaves scars. And surviving when your friends don't, that's a weight you carry forever. This is part 3. The final chapter of Captain Thomas Wardle's story. And I'm going to be honest with you, this one's going to be tough because we're not just talking about battles anymore. We're talking about what comes after, the part of war that doesn't make it into the Hollywood movies, the part that's harder to talk about than German machine guns and panzer tanks. But it needs to be told because these men didn't just fight for freedom. They paid for it with their bodies, with their minds, with their futures. And if we're going to honor them properly, we need to tell the whole truth, not just the glory, the cost. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because these are the stories that matter, the untold stories, the uncomfortable stories, the stories that make us understand what war really means. Subscribe, share. Let's make sure no one forgets what these men gave. Now let's finish Captain Wardle's story. Let's talk about what happened after Sword Beach. June 6, 1944, 11:47 p.m., 13 hours after Captain Wardle first stepped on to Sword Beach. He was still alive, against all probability, against all logic, still breathing, still fighting. His platoon had dug in on a ridgeline overlooking the beach.
Behind them, the invasion was still underway. Ships as far as the eye could see. Men, equipment, supplies. The largest military operation in human history. And it was working. But the cost, oh God, the cost. Wardle sat in his foxhole and tried to count how many of his men were left. He had landed with 50 soldiers. Now, 23 had made it through the day, just over half. But that number told only part of the story. Private Mitchell, dead on the beach, never made it 50 yards. Corporal Davies, bled out on the sand. Wardle had tried to stop the bleeding, had held pressure on the wound, but there was too much blood, too much damage. Davies had looked at him, said, "Tell my mom I did my duty," and died. Sergeant Harris, wounded, evacuated, would survive, but his war was over. Bobby Thompson, the hero who destroyed the Panzer, killed by German artillery at 3 p.m., direct hit on his position. They found his dog tags. That was all. 27 men, dead or out of action, in one day, from one platoon. And Wardle knew every single name, every face, every story. The man from Birmingham who talked about opening a pub after the war, the quiet kid from Scotland who wrote poetry, the sergeant who had a daughter he'd never met because she was born after he shipped out. All gone. Wardle wrote in his diary that night, "We won the beach, but the price, the terrible price. I'm not sure victory is supposed to feel like this." But there was no time for grief, no time for processing, no time for healing, because the war went on, and Wardle went with it. The battle for Normandy lasted until August, 77 days of continuous combat. Every day brought new horrors, new losses, new impossibilities that somehow had to be overcome. Wardle fought at Caen, the objective they were supposed to take on D-Day. Took 6 weeks of brutal urban combat, house to house, street to street, German snipers, booby traps, artillery that turned entire neighborhoods into rubble. He fought at the Falaise Pocket, where the Allied forces trapped and destroyed what was left of the German army in France. 10,000 Germans killed, 50,000 captured, but it cost British and Canadian forces dearly. By the time Normandy was over, Wardle's original platoon of 50 men had been replaced 3 times. 150 soldiers rotated through his command. Only 30 survived the campaign unwounded, and Wardle led them all. Every day, every battle. Never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Always first into danger, last to seek safety. His superiors noticed. He was promoted to major, given a company command, more responsibility, more men depending on him, more names to remember, more families to write to when those men didn't come home. September 1944. Brussels, Paris, cities across France and Belgium being liberated, civilians flooding into the streets, flowers, wine, kisses, joy. The newsreels show this, the photographs capture it. Liberation, freedom, victory, and it was real. The happiness was genuine. These people had suffered under Nazi occupation for 4 years. Now they were free, thanks to soldiers like Wardle and his men. But Wardle wrote something in his diary during the liberation of Brussels that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "They're celebrating in the streets, dancing, singing, and I'm happy for them, truly. But all I can think about is the men who died to get us here. Mitchell, Davies, Thompson, all the others. They should be here."
They earned this moment more than I did. But they're in graves in Normandy. And I'm getting kissed by French girls and called a hero. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel fair. This is survivor's guilt. The psychological wound that affects so many combat veterans. The question that has no answer. Why did I survive when they didn't? What made me special? What made me deserve life when they got death? And Wardle carried this question for the rest of his life. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime was destroyed. The Allies had won. Major Thomas Wardle was in Germany when the news came. His unit was preparing to push into Berlin. Instead, they got the order. Stand down. The war is over. Soldiers all around him were celebrating, cheering, crying, hugging. The war was over. They had survived. They could go home. Wardle felt numb. He had been at war for 5 years, from 1940 to 1945, through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany. He had seen more combat than most soldiers see in 10 wars. He had led men through impossible situations, had watched hundreds die, had killed enemy soldiers whose faces he still saw when he closed his eyes, and now it was just over? How do you turn that off? How do you go from daily life and death combat to what? Civilian life? A normal job? Pretending that the last 5 years didn't happen? The British Army tried. They had demobilization programs, classes on how to reintegrate into society, advice on finding employment, psychological evaluations. But how do you evaluate someone who had done what Wardle had done? What questions do you ask? What box do you check to indicate first man on Sword Beach, led 50 assaults on fortified positions, watched 200 men die under his command, somehow still functional? There was no box for that. Thomas Wardle returned to England in August 1945. He was 25 years old. He had left as a 20-year-old volunteer, eager to serve, ready for adventure. He came back different. His family didn't know how to talk to him. His mother kept asking if he was okay. He kept saying yes. They both knew it was a lie, but what else could he say? How do you explain what he had seen to people who had spent the war in England? They had experienced the Blitz, they had suffered, they had sacrificed, but they hadn't stormed Sword Beach. Wardle tried to return to his pre-war life. He had been studying engineering before the war. He went back to university, sat in lectures about mathematics and physics, tried to care about stress calculations and thermodynamics, but his mind kept wandering. Back to the beach, back to the bunker, back to Mitchell's face as he fell, back to Davy's last words, back to Thompson grinning after destroying the Panzer. He wasn't in the classroom, not really. Part of him never left Normandy. In 1946, Thomas Wardle was awarded the Military Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor that the British Army can bestow, for his actions on D-Day, for being the first man on Sword Beach, for leading the assault that broke open the German defenses. He attended the ceremony, wore his uniform, stood at attention as the medal was pinned to his chest, saluted, said thank you, and felt nothing. Later, he told a reporter, "They gave me a medal for surviving, but the real heroes got graves. What kind of sense does that make?" This is the uncomfortable truth about military decorations. They go to the survivors, to the men who lived to tell the story. But often, the bravest men are the ones who died, the ones who never got to receive their medals, never got to come home. Wardle knew this. It haunted him. Thomas Wardle lived until 1997, died peacefully in his sleep, age 81. Surrounded by family. A good death, better than he had any right to expect given what he had been through. In his later years, he did something that many veterans struggle with. He talked about the war, about D-Day, about what it really was like. Schools invited him to speak. He accepted, stood in front of teenagers and told them the truth. Not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized heroic narrative, the truth. He told them about the fear, about the friends who died, about the moral complexity of killing, about the cost of victory, and he told them one thing over and over again. War is sometimes necessary, but it is never good, never glorious, never something to seek. We fought because we had to, because the alternative was worse. But don't ever mistake necessity for virtue. This is the wisdom that comes from being the first man on Sword Beach, from surviving when so many didn't, from carrying that weight for 56 years. Today, if you visit Sword Beach, there's a memorial. It lists the names of the British soldiers who fell there on June 6, 1944. Hundreds of names.
Each one a life cut short. Each one a story that ended on that beach. Captain Thomas Wardle's name isn't on it, because he survived. He made it home. He lived a full life. But I promise you, part of him is still on that beach. With Mitchell, with Davies, with Thompson, with all the others. Part of him never left. And maybe that's the real cost of courage. Not death, but survival. Carrying the weight of those who didn't make it. Living with the question that has no answer. Why me? Wardle's story is important not just because of what he did, but because of what it represents. D-Day was successful because thousands of men like Wardle did impossible things. British soldiers, American soldiers, Canadian soldiers, fighting together, dying together, winning together. Sword Beach was just one of 5 beaches. Wardle was just one of 156,000 Allied troops who landed that day. But every single one of them had a story. Every single one of them faced death and kept going anyway. And we need to remember all of them. Not just the famous generals, not just the medal recipients. All of them. The privates, the sergeants, the men whose names are on memorials but whose stories were never told. Because they saved the world. They defeated fascism. They liberated Europe. They gave us the freedom we enjoy today. And the least we can do is remember. Which brings me to you. Yes, you, watching this video right now. These stories matter. These men matter. And if we don't tell their stories, if we don't keep their memory alive, then they die twice. Once on the battlefield, and again when the last person who remembers them is gone. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for them. Because every subscriber means these stories reach more people. Every share means another person learns about heroes like Wardle, Mitchell, Davies, and Thompson, like all the others. Like this video, leave a comment. Tell me whose story you want to hear next. What battle? What hero? What moment of World War II deserves to be remembered? And most importantly, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your father, your grandfather, your teacher, your friend who loves history, anyone who appreciates real courage, real sacrifice, real heroes. Because these men gave everything so we could have everything. The least we can do is remember their names. Now I know what you're thinking. What's next? What story am I going to tell next? Here's a hint. We're staying in Normandy, but we're moving beaches. And we're going to talk about a moment that most people have never heard about. A moment on Omaha Beach that was even more desperate than what happened on Sword Beach. A moment when the entire invasion hung by a thread. And one American soldier did something so brave, so reckless, so absolutely insane that it turned the tide. But you're going to have to subscribe to find out who that soldier was and what he did, because that video drops next week. And trust me, it's going to blow your mind. Until then, remember, these men were real. Their courage was real. Their sacrifice was real. And their story deserves to be told. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for helping keep their memory alive. For Private Mitchell, who never made it off the beach. For Corporal Davies, who died doing his duty. For Bobby Thompson, who destroyed a Panzer with his bare hands. For Sergeant Harris, who took a bullet and kept going anyway. And for Captain Thomas Wardle, the first man on Sword Beach, who carried the weight of their sacrifice for the rest of his life. We remember. We honor. We never forget. If you've made it this far, please hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know what you thought of this 3-part series. Your support means everything and helps ensure these stories continue to reach new audiences. See you in the next video. And remember, Real heroes, real stories, real history. That's what we do here.